Okay, so you want to dive into term limits for politicians.
Mhm.
Well, we're tackling this piece, and
Yeah.
it argues for this system that really kind of throws open the doors to some interesting possibilities.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
But, of course, some potential curveballs, too.
Yeah,
And,
for sure.
it feels like everyone's got an opinion about how politics should work, especially these days.
Right.
So we're going to dissect this opinion piece.
Okay.
We're going to pull out all those juicy arguments for term limits
Yeah.
and really kind of dig into whether they hold water.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What I think is really striking about this particular piece is just the sheer scope of what it proposes.
Okay.
It's not just about, limiting terms for like presidents or prime ministers.
Yeah.
We're talking like city council members all the way up to the highest offices in the land.
It's a complete system overhaul.
Yeah.
And the source argues this is the only way to combat what they call this crisis of representation.
Right.
Which I think a lot of us can relate to, that feeling that politicians are just out of touch.
Yeah, and kind of entrenched.
Entrenched, yeah.
In their own world up there in the ivory towers.
Exactly.
And I think that's where their kind of central argument comes in. 2 terms and you're out.
2 terms and you are out.
No more career politicians.
Wow.
No more dynasties where you have the same families holding power for generations.
Right.
Just imagine the potential impact of a system like that.
Yeah.
On the one hand,
Yeah.
you've got the possibility of a truly level playing field where fresh ideas, diverse voices can actually break through.
Right.
But on the flip side,
Yeah.
could that kind of constant turnover lead to instability?
Yeah.
Would we lose valuable experience just when we need it most?
It's a trade-off.
It is.
Right.
Yeah.
And the source really leans into the potential benefits of this kind of political shakeup.
Okay.
They argue that term limits would force politicians to be more accountable, more responsive to the people they represent, because they would constantly be campaigning.
Right, because they don't have that, guarantee anymore.
Exactly.
It's that idea that, a limited time in office keeps politicians on their toes.
On their toes.
Because they know they only have a set number of years to make a difference.
Right.
So they might be more likely to prioritize the needs of their constituents.
Because those votes aren't a given anymore.
Exactly.
Right.
But I guess it also raises the question, would that constant pressure to deliver those short-term wins come at the expense of tackling larger, more complex issues?
Right.
The things that require a longer view.
It's like you need to prove yourself,
Yeah.
but at the same time, you're grappling with these really complex issues that may take decades to fully address.
Right.
So it's a delicate balance.
It is.
And that's where the source gets really radical.
Okay.
They argue that to truly maximize the benefits of term limits, we need to rethink the whole idea of how we're selecting our leaders in the first place.
Oh, interesting. So how do they propose we do that?
Okay, so this is where they propose something kind of radical, appointing ministers based not on their political maneuvering or connections, but on their actual expertise in the field.
Wow.
So imagine a world where the Minister of Health was a renowned doctor, or the Minister of Finance was like this brilliant economist with years of experience on Wall Street.
And a real expert in the field.
An actual expert in the field, yeah.
Interesting.
It's a fascinating thought.
It is.
It's a little unnerving,
Yeah.
right? To think of government ministers being chosen for their knowledge and skills.
Right.
Rather than their political savvy.
It's like they're trying to take the politics out of politics.
It is.
But then, who decides who those experts are?
Right. Who gets to choose?
And would those experts even want to leave their respective fields where they're likely very successful to navigate, the often messy world of government?
It's true.
It's a compelling idea.
Yeah.
But it raises a whole new set of questions about how such a system would actually function in the real world.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is uncharted territory.
It is.
You got all these radical ideas bumping up against the really complex realities of how governments actually work.
And that's where I think, the rubber meets the road, right?
Exactly.
This source is really painting this picture of a completely different political landscape.
Yeah.
But they don't really offer a roadmap for getting there.
Yeah, that's true.
It's more about kind of sparking a fundamental rethink of how we approach governance.
It is.
Yeah.
So if we kind of circle back to your initial interest,
Okay.
How would term limits impact accountability?
Okay.
It seems like the source just thinks it's a guaranteed win.
Okay.
Like more responsive politicians, closer connection to the people they represent.
Right.
But, like,
Like it's that simple.
is it really that straightforward?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
what they argue is that with term limits, politicians, they can't coast on name recognition or past successes.
Right.
They have to kind of every few years convince voters all over again that they deserve another term.
It's true.
So theoretically, that could make them more in tune with the needs of their constituents.
Yeah, constantly having to re-earn that vote of confidence.
I see.
But
Yeah.
could that same pressure backfire?
Oh, absolutely.
You know, if politicians are constantly feeling like they're on the campaign trail,
Right.
would that incentivize, like, short-term thinking?
I think that's a huge risk.
Right. Quick fixes that'll give them votes, but won't actually address the root of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a key question I think that the source doesn't really fully address.
Yeah.
You know, they're so focused on this like ideal scenario, right?
Right.
Term limits lead to this more engaged and responsive government.
Yeah.
But the reality could be much messier, right?
Yeah.
You could end up with politicians who are just so focused on the next election, they don't want to make those tough decisions, right?
Right, exactly.
The potentially unpopular decisions, but that are necessary for long-term progress.
It's always that classic dilemma, short-term gains versus this long-term vision.
Yeah.
And it seems like this source is really willing to bet on the fact that shaking things up, even if it creates instability at first, is ultimately the best way to break free from the status quo.
Right. They're putting a lot of faith in that.
They are.
Yeah.
You know, increased accountability, fresh perspectives, a break from these, like, political dynasties.
Yeah.
They think that outweighs the risks.
They do.
But we have to remember, this is just one perspective.
It is, yeah.
One proposed solution to a very big problem.
Yeah. And a complex one.
Yeah.
For sure.
And it's a solution that comes with its own set of potential drawbacks.
Of course.
You know, we've talked about short-termism,
Yeah.
the potential loss of valuable experience.
Right.
What other concerns do you have when you think about implementing something like this?
Well, you know, I think one concern is that frequent turnover in government could really hinder the continuity of long-term projects or policies.
That's a really good point.
Like, imagine, you know,
Yeah.
a complex infrastructure project that takes like a decade to complete, right?
Right.
Constant changes in leadership could lead to delays.
Oh, for sure.
Disruptions.
Yep.
Or even like the outright abandonment of some of these really essential initiatives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's like this clash between this desire for fresh perspectives,
Right.
but also this need for stability and experience to actually execute on those ideas.
Yeah.
So you need to balance that energy of a newly elected official with this kind of, like, institutional knowledge
Right.
that's built over years and years and years, decades even, of public service.
Precisely. Yeah. And that's a challenge that I think any system of term limits would really need to grapple with. Like,
Yeah.
how do you ensure a smooth transition of knowledge and expertise
Yeah.
when you have administrations changing every few years? That's the question.
Yeah, it's like, how do you pass the torch?
Right.
Make sure that experience doesn't just disappear.
Exactly. And that's where I think, you know,
Yeah.
the source is kind of silent on like the practicalities
Yeah, they don't really get into that.
of how this would actually work.
Yeah.
You know, they make this compelling case
They do.
for the benefits.
Yeah.
But, you know, they don't really answer any of those like nitty-gritty questions
It's true.
about how you would implement it
Yeah.
and what the potential downsides would be.
It's like they sketched out this big vision, but they haven't really
Yeah.
nailed down the logistics.
Right. Like they've got us thinking about what could be,
Yeah.
but I don't know if they really sell us on
Oh, yeah.
whether it's actually achievable
Yeah.
or even desirable in every case.
It's true.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the beauty of these deep dives. It's like, we're not just taking this at face value.
Yeah, we're really like
We're really digging in.
getting into the weeds.
Exactly.
Exploring those nuances.
So for everyone listening,
Yeah.
I think if you're going to take one thing away from this whole conversation,
Yeah.
it's really that importance of critical thinking.
For sure.
Like, don't just accept these arguments at face value,
Right.
even if they sound good on paper.
Exactly. Ask the tough questions.
You ask those tough questions.
Yeah, and look at both sides.
Consider the counter arguments, because there's rarely ever an easy answer,
Especially when we're talking about how we govern ourselves, right?
especially with something this important.
Yeah.
So,
And I think this piece, whether you agree with the conclusions or not,
yeah.
it's done what good political writing, I think, should do.
Okay.
It's sparked a debate. It's
Okay.
it's challenged some assumptions.
For sure.
And honestly, it's kind of left us with more questions than answers.
It really has.
But I think that's okay.
It is okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's a good thing.
Because these are, questions that every democracy wrestles with, right?
Exactly.
Accountability.
Right.
Experience.
Yeah.
How do you balance change with stability?
Yep.
There's never going to be like a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly.
Right.
It's going to look different everywhere.
What works in one country might be a disaster in another.
For sure.
And what seems like a good idea now, maybe later on,
Yeah.
it's not.
All hindsight, right?
Exactly. So we just have to keep having these conversations.
We do.
Keep engaging with all these different viewpoints.
Yep.
And never just stop questioning the systems that govern our lives.
Beautifully said.
Because ultimately,
Yeah.
the best way to ensure a healthy democracy
Yeah.
is to have,
Yeah.
citizens who are informed, who are engaged, and who are willing to think critically about the challenges.
It all comes back to that.
It does.
Informed citizenry.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note,
Yeah.
I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive
Okay.
into this fascinating world
Yeah.
of term limits.
Yeah, it was a good one.
We hope this conversation has given you something to think about
Yeah.
and maybe even inspired you to do a little digging of your own.
Exactly.
And as always,
Yeah.
keep those brains buzzing
Keep thinking.
and happy deep diving.
Until next time.